Hello Sodbusters! A year ago I put out a video about what to do with green potatoes. And in that video I talked about how you can use those green potatoes to plant a new crop of potatoes, which is true. And I also talked about how you can plant a crop of potatoes in the fall for a spring harvest. And that is also true. And I demonstrated that in that video. Or I should say I demonstrated planting those potatoes. But that crop didn't work out well for me. I did a follow-up video showing the results of that, which were not good. And I'm going to give it another try. I think I may have planted a little bit early, and so those potatoes started growing too early, and instead of just going dormant when the cold hit, they died off. I also think there was a problem with planting those in a raised bed. You can't have success with a fall planting in a raised bed, but there is a risk because the soil can be more affected by the air temperature. Because the soil is raised above ground level, it's not as insulated. And also I could have mitigated that had I covered up that planting with more mulch or soil, and I failed to do that adequately. So this year I'm going to try my planting in my in-ground beds. Hopefully that will give more insulation. There's a few things that you need to do when you plant your fall potatoes for a spring harvest, and one is you need to plant them a little more deeply than you would the spring potatoes. You don't want those planted potatoes to freeze. If they freeze, then they're just going to go bad. You also don't want to cut up your potatoes as you might do for a spring planting, because when you cut those up, the potatoes are more likely to rot over the winter while they're in the ground. You also want to plant your potatoes in a place that is well drained, because you don't want them to be sitting in water, which could cause those potatoes to rot and go bad. So there's a few factors that could cause a fall planting to fail. But if you get a successful fall planting, what will happen in the spring is as soon as that soil warms up, those potatoes will start to sprout and grow. So you'll get earlier growth and get an earlier harvest from those fall planted potatoes. Now we're in the last weekend of October. We've already had a hard freeze this year, so hopefully we're past temperatures that would cause these potatoes to start growing prematurely. As I plant these potatoes, I hope that I'm not causing myself problems with them, and this is illustrative of a problem with storage. When I dug my potato harvest this year, I didn't store them well. I put them in a bucket, covered them, intended to get them stored away in the basement, but they were put into a mudroom, which gets a little warm during the summer, and all of my potatoes developed sprouts. Now they have not grown much, so I'm hoping that this won't be a problem, that these will just go dormant and then continue growing when the spring comes. I've got very little to lose by giving it a try, other than a handful of potatoes, so we'll get these in the ground and see what happens. As I mentioned, for a fall planting you want to put the potatoes fairly deep into the ground, but you also don't want them to be sitting in water. And this area of our yard doesn't tend to drain really well. I've worked on building up the soil over the last couple years to try to make it better draining, and this is some pretty nice soil here. But there are still a few drainage problems. So I'm not going to be putting my potatoes super deep into the ground, but instead I'm going to plant them and then put soil on top. So we have the heat retention of the ground and insulation of more soil on top. And then I'll put some compost on top of that. So I'm gonna make 2 trenches about 4 inches deep here, and then I'll put my potatoes in there. And as I mentioned, you want to plant whole potatoes. You don't want to cut them up, and you want potatoes of a pretty good size because they're going to need the nutrients from that potato once the plant starts growing, and that needs to be retained over winter. Before I put the potatoes in the ground, I'm going to add some bone meal to my trenches. Bone meal is high in phosphorus, so that's going to help root development once the potatoes start growing. Somebody asked me about fertilizing in my green potato video, and I did not fertilize those potatoes when I did that fall planting. The reason was I didn't want to stimulate that growth too quickly. I'm going to go ahead and fertilize this time to hopefully give these the best chance of success once they do start growing in the spring. And I'm planting a dozen potatoes here. To hedge my bets, I probably could plant more, put them about 6 inches apart, but we'll give this a try and hopefully we'll get some success from some of these. And now that those are covered over, we'll put some more soil on top. The soil that I'm using here is a mix of a bulk commercial compost that comes from a local nursery, along with some horse manure that I also got locally, with some fill dirt mixed in from some digging projects elsewhere in the yard. Although it's not the topic of this video, I want to warn people to be careful about what soils you use. There's been a lot of reporting lately about people using commercially available compost garden soils and manure that has had persistent herbicides in that soil, and people have lost crops because of it. In my case, I've used this soil to help build up this garden and haven't seen any issues, and so I feel pretty comfortable using it to cover over these potatoes. Now that the potatoes are covered with soil, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle a balanced granular fertilizer over the top of the bed so that it'll release through the bed over the winter and be ready for the potatoes when they start growing. And it's not lost on me that my little potato bed here has a strong resemblance to a grave, but it is, after all, almost Halloween, so maybe it's fitting. And when I talk about a balanced fertilizer, I'm talking about the three numbers that you see on a fertilizer bag. These represent the percentage levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, or potassium. The way I often think of these numbers is up, down, and all around. The first number, which represents nitrogen, that helps to develop the leafy growth above ground. That's up. The second number, the phosphorus, that helps to develop the root development. That's down. And the third number, that's the potash or potassium, that helps to develop flowering and fruiting. So that's all around. So if you're ever wondering about your fertilizer and what the numbers represent and just what they help in general, that's one way I think of it, is up, down, and all around. And in this case, when I say a balanced fertilizer, I'm talking about the numbers are fairly even. So you're getting an even dose of each of those elements. As I sprinkle this fertilizer, I could measure it out carefully based on the size of the bed, but I'm just sprinkling to give a good covering over the soil. Because the element levels are fairly low with this fertilizer, there's not too much concern about over-applying the fertilizer. You would have concern if you were applying directly to plants and had a high nitrogen fertilizer, or something like a fresh chicken manure, and that could burn your green plants. But in this case, we'll have plenty of time over the winter for this fertilizer to work its way into the soil, and I am not concerned about adding too much fertilizer in this case. And now we'll cover everything with compost. And this compost is from my own compost bins, so I know the source. It's a mixture of grass clippings, wood chips, and kitchen waste that has gone through my bins and is broken down in large part, but also contains some elements that haven't totally broken down, some grass and so on that is still decomposing. And I don't mind, that'll have time over the winter to continue breaking down and helping to not only keep the soil warm, but also help to develop and support good organisms in the soil. So that puts these potatoes to bed, and now we just wait until spring and see what happens. I've got a pretty deep bed now of soil and compost, so hopefully that will keep these warm enough that they won't freeze over the winter and they'll be ready to go come spring. If you have done a fall planting of potatoes for a spring crop and had success with it, I'd love to hear your stories, or if you've run into problems, I'd like to hear what you think went wrong with yours. Come spring, I'll go ahead and take a video to show what happened with this planting, and hopefully I'll have a success story as we see potato plants growing here. When I do that video, I'll go ahead and post that right here so that you can see those results. Until then, Google's going to put a video here that they think you'll really like. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.